Everybody, for GDPR reasons, would prefer that they are not identified. If you just want to turn your video off now, or if you want to change your name as your sign-in as well, but it will be recorded, and we will make this available on the YouTube, the IOSH YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We'll send you notification of that as well. So I think everybody is in, and I'll hand over to our first speaker, Michael Collins.
Lovely, thank you, Brianna. I'll just share my screen here. Taking a little bit longer than expected. There we go. Okay. Right. Thank you very much, Brianna. And thanks to everybody sort of for coming this evening. Some of you will know me, some of you don't know me. My name is Michael Collins. I'm the IOSH Regional Manager for the Ireland region. I joined IOSH on the 15th of June. And for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to speak to you about my experience joining a new company and being inducted into a new job remotely due to the COVID-19 restrictions. So as we all know, so starting a new job in normal times is daunting enough. Feelings of excitement and anxiety and often fear of not fitting into the culture of a new job or a new team or not being liked by your colleagues is quite common. Sort of, whilst we may be confident in our ability to do the job that we're due to start, it's natural to be apprehensive. Simple things like sort of navigating sort of the geography of a new workplace or a new sort of organization is confusing at the best of times. But there's always that comfort factor that sort of, you know, there are people around you. So, you know, you can get a feel for sort of, you know, the natural sort of rhythms in an organization and sort of the just general sort of lay of the land. Sort of if you do sort of, you know, find yourself a little bit sort of isolated, so it's very easy to reach out and just ask for help there and then. You don't have to worry about things like sort of, you know, health and safety. So there are people there to do that for you. There's lots of support mechanisms around you, sort of in terms of the HR team and sort of the IT team and sort of the guy that fixes your chair when you break it on your first day. You know, there's all those natural things that you expect to be there. Sort of, but it's still sort of quite a stressful event starting in a new business. So when starting sort of remotely as a remote new starter, there's additional pressures to find your feet and be seen within the organization. Sort of, you know, when you can't really experience the normal social or cultural supports that sort of everybody else has had the chance to sort of to enjoy, can often rapidly lead to feelings of isolation and sort of can lead to a little bit of insecurity sort of from the individual. As employers and managers and colleagues, we can often influence this both positively and negatively by our level of engagement or disengagement, depending on sort of on the person. When you put somebody sort of, you know, into a new job and sort of, you know, they are now part of a new organization, but they have the responsibility to sort of effectively build their own workspace, sort of, you know, to decide, you know, how they're going to work, where they're going to work, to worry about things like their level of connectivity, if they're going to be, as we are, sort of hosting a lot of online meetings, conversations, to be responsible for your own sort of health and safety at work. Even though you're at home, you are still, as we all know, you're still at work, and sort of, you know, there's obligations, employee obligations, employer obligations to be fulfilled. But the pressure of that falls on sort of the remote worker, sort of, you know, and when you've all the normal worries about starting a new job, sort of, you know, these just seem to be compiling issues that sort of, you know, one on top of each other. You pile that in sort of the domestic distractions of working remotely. Sort of as I started sort of on the 15th of June, just at the exact same time, sort of I had one daughter who was sort of at university that all of a sudden sort of, you know, had to come home quickly because the university closed. I had another daughter whose school closed. My wife had just gone through sort of major abdominal surgery and was discharged from hospital sort of much earlier than would normally have happened. So all of these things were happening in the background, and I was still trying to sort of get my head around sort of, you know, starting a new job in a new organization that sort of, you know, when I had met nobody in the actual the company. So the stresses that can sort of, you know, can manifest themselves in different ways. And as an organization, sort of, you know, it really was up to them to effectively helped me sort of get a vision as to sort of, you know, what was the best way to sort of, you know, to navigate that and as quickly as possible. So I'm going to talk you through very briefly how IOSH as an organization did that. They started sort of back in sort of at the start of the year, sort of, you know, there was, and through 2019, there were considerable organizational changes going on within the organization from top to bottom, sort of, you know, restructuring, new people coming in, sort of, you know, realignment of sort of groupings within sort of the different directorates. So whilst all that change was going on and being implemented sort of in early sort of 2020, then when COVID hit, all of a sudden sort of all the staff who worked at the Grange had to be sent home and they had to work from home. The business had to keep going. So specialized teams and sort of, you know, groupings were put together in order to actually make sure that that was as seamless as possible. And that was about sort of, you know, facilitating the existing employees and the existing sort of teams that were in the organization. But because of the restructuring had gone on, there was a considerable number of new starts were scheduled to start sort of, you know, from mid-March through until sort of the end of July, myself being one of them. And all these new starts were going to be starting working from home. And the organization knew that. So there was a recognition that sort of that instead of just putting sort of what would be the normal induction process in place, there had to be much more of an emphasis on sort of introduction as opposed to induction. So they set about sort of putting tools in place to automate sort of the onboarding sort of administration process, which made it really simple. So in the tools that they sort of that they use, things like Sapling HR, Meta Compliance, made it very, very easy sort of for new sort of remote starters, sort of, you know, to actually sort of, you know, find out sort of the compliance things that they had to do from an HR perspective and sort of, you know, from sort of a learning perspective. And they were chunked down into sort of, you know, consumable bites. So instead of having to do everything at the same time, sort of, you know, they tried to sort of automate the process to make it as like the process would be if you were actually sort of in the Grange. Again, the tools that they used sort of were quite cleverly structured, sort of taking Sapling sort of for instance, and I know there's loads of other sort of similar automated HR sort of technologies out there, but the way they did it was about sort of making sure that sort of, you know, it was as easy as possible to find out who people were. And it was the induction process was completely focused on meeting people. The logic behind that was sort of, you know, the faster sort of, you know, we can get our new starts sort of, you know, meeting people, the faster they will feel part of a functional operational group and then feel part of a wider directorate and feel part of the one IOSH. That sort of, you know, is so important to the way IOSH works, because there's nothing happens remotely within the organization. So whatever happens at sort of governance filters and affects every single sort of touch point throughout the organization, right down to the sort of the networks and the volunteers and the members. And that is the same for every part of the organization. Nothing happens in isolation. So for that to happen and continue being sort of as efficient as it could be, we had to make sure that sort of that the new starters knew the people they needed to know. So there was a two-tier sort of introduction process. There was the people you must meet and the people it would be nice to meet. And sort of, you know, and the managers within the organizations, both the line managers, the senior management team, the wider sort of strategic teams as well, had to make sure that this was happening sort of consistently throughout the organization. And the focus changed from being sort of a facilitated sort of meeting to being engineered accessibility. So engineering a mechanism by which new starters could actually sort of have access to people at every level in the business, sort of without it being sort of a drawn out, complicated sort of, you know, process of sort of making appointments and sort of rearranging, scheduling sort of diaries, etc. So it was really about sort of making sure that sort of, you know, people knew who they needed to speak to by using the automated sort of technologies like Sapling, and then making it easy for them to actually sort of access it. And that meant that the people sort of, you know, who were already in the organization had to step up and make themselves available, had to proactively sort of, you know, reach out to sort of new starters coming in. But if they didn't know that new starters were coming in or where they were coming in, how could they do that? So again, that sort of a second tier, second level sort of process of introducing new starters to the wider organization became sort of, you know, just as important. We started a buddy scheme, sort of, well, we didn't start a buddy scheme, we always had a buddy scheme, but sort of we elevated the buddy scheme to make sure that sort of, you know, that security and that sort of comfort factor that you would get if you were working on site as a new starter in the Grange, you would still get that sort of that security, that friend, that there was always somebody you could turn to and ask the silly questions, not the silly questions like where's the loo or where's the kettle, you know, but silly questions like sort of, you know, who is this person? You know, I know I have to speak to them, but who are they? But that was all around sort of, you know, the individual's functions and sort of the people they needed to speak to and how they would deal with. At the same time, sort of there was a real emphasis on creating and maintaining, sort of without it being artificial, the social networking side. So technologies like sort of Workspace, which is a Facebook technology, was employed, and it's like an internal Facebook. So it's an IOSH Facebook. So, you know, we have sort of functional groups, we have social groups, there's a break room, which is effectively like a virtual canteen. And through that mechanism, sort of, you know, we have people running sort of quizzes, we have guys who sort of who play a bit of music sort of every Friday. They'll post up sort of a recording of a song they've recorded, or there's people putting up pictures of their pets in the same way you would in any social media environment. But it's specifically about, again, creating that sort of one IOS, that feeling of sort of accessibility without it feeling like it's being constructed or it's being forced or people are obliged to do it. And this was all about sort of, you know, again, the different sort of layers of management, understanding that sort of, you know, that they had a responsibility sort of not only sort of to get sort of people who were joining the company up to a functional and operational speed, but to really get them to feel that they belonged, that they weren't isolated, they weren't remote from sort of the already existing sort of family that IOSH sort of genuinely believes it is. A lot of this involves sort of, you know, good structured communications and sort of Bev, the CEO, has been sort of the forefront of this. She only this morning we had an all staff briefing, which happens regularly, which is very much sort of, you know, the senior management teams advising and involving sort of the wider employees sort of within the organization around sort of things that are happening, things that are sort of, you know, both at a strategic level and things that are sort of, you know, progressing and will happen in the future, making them aware of it, making them sort of part of it. That then is chunked down into sort of she sort of puts out a monthly video, which is a real sort of, you know, it's more of a welfare type video, sort of where she is talking about things that have happened, contributions that people have made, and then right down to sort of a weekly email, which is very much sort of, you know, how she feels things are happening. So again, it's that sort of, you know, multi-level but not highly formal sort of, you know, communications strategy. And it was all very much around sort of making everybody feel that sort of, you know, that they avoid NOTMA. Now, as you know, in sort of in OSH and especially in IOSH, we love our acronyms, and sort of, you know, NOTMA is basically sort of no one tells me anything. And that was the whole strategy, was to make sure that nobody coming into the organization from day one would feel that they were left out. And by doing that, you're sort of, you know, stripping away all the causes and all the reasons and all sort of the things that can actually create those little sort of insecurities and stresses that can manifest themselves in people not performing, and therefore having a knock-on effect on sort of, you know, other teams and reducing the performance of those teams. And that's my journey. That's how my induction into the organization sort of happens. And I can honestly say, sort of, you know, from the 15th of June to today, I actually feel as if I've been in the organization for years. It was just such a seamless and easy sort of journey into the business. So thanks very much, Brianna. If you want to take over from there.
Thanks very much, Michael. A great introduction. Brendan Mullins and Kay will hopefully be back after Brendan. Brendan is the Environmental Health and Safety Manager at Ballina Beverages, who has implemented home working, obviously in his company. So he's just going to take you through his experience of that. So thanks very much, Brendan.
Okay. And hopefully the technology will work okay. Okay, so can you just let me know if you can see the screen there, okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Brianna, and welcome everybody to this session this evening. And I'm going to take you through a little bit, I suppose, of the experience that we have had on our site in relation to the implementation of remote working during this pandemic, and talk a little bit about our experiences, pros and cons, and how it has worked, and I suppose some of the ongoing challenges that we still have in relation to that. And it struck me, I suppose, as Kay was opening her conversation there, she talked about the 3 different types of remote worker. And I suppose it's something I hadn't thought about in detail when I was preparing the presentation. But just to explain, I suppose the remote working aspect for us is specifically people working at home. And I guess that's the basis of the presentation that I have here for you this evening. So just a little bit about myself, first of all. Brendan Mullins, I've worked for about 25 years now in environmental health and safety. In the slide on the bottom left here, hopefully you can see that there's a number of the different companies that I have worked with over that period of time, a wide variety, I suppose, of industry. And my current role finds me working for a company called Ballina Beverages. We're based in Ballina, County Mayo, which anybody who's dialed in from the UK or from further afield, we're based in the west of Ireland. And Ballina Beverages is a manufacturing facility for the Coca-Cola company. So our role there is to manufacture concentrate and beverage bases for our bottlers who are our customers. So we don't produce a consumable product on the site. Our products go to bottlers who then do their magic and distribute that around to consumers. So I just want to talk a little bit, first of all, about, by way of introduction, I suppose, to mention what we have done since, I suppose, we're probably 7 months down the line now at this stage, and how that has impacted our site. So during the lockdown process, which started, I think, back in March, if I can remember correctly, our manufacturing operation continued at the site. So when I say we continued there, our operations and critical support personnel still maintained a presence on the site and was necessary to support the manufacturing operation that we do, and in order to manufacture our products and to distribute those to our customers. However, we did have a significant proportion of our personnel who undertook remote working quite suddenly, I suppose, like a lot of other employees around the country. So we had 150 employees who took up the remote working option. And this consisted of a number of different types of employees, I suppose. So first of all, and I guess the most important to us, was what we would deem to be vulnerable workers. And under this category, what we would mean here is for health-related reasons. So for various health conditions that people might have had, we deemed it necessary that those employees would work from home. That included people, I suppose, who could support the operation from home, or in some cases it might have been due to the fact that they did have certain health-related conditions. We didn't want them on site and potentially being affected by becoming infected with the virus. Under that group of workers, we also included personnel who might have had a spouse or other people living in the household who might have had some health issues as well. So the vulnerable workers, or that group, was more wide-ranging than just the workers themselves, but also it related to potential impact within the household. As part of that group of workers of 150 as well, we did have a number of support functions, so non-operations or non-critical support staff. So admin-based, finance, customer services, typically people who, with the right infrastructure, could support the operation remotely. And of the 150 employees then, a number of those were full-time and still remain to be full-time 7 months later. So approximately 1/3, so approximately 100 employees are still remote working on a full-time basis. And then we have maybe a smaller proportion, so probably 50 of those who rotate on a week on, week off. So for instance, in my own role in EHS, our small team work on the rotation, if you like, of week on site and 1 week working remotely. So we alternate on that pattern. I suppose, like many other organizations, we had a crisis management team, maybe called different things in different organizations, but normally that would consist of our leadership team and then some key stakeholders. So the key stakeholders within this group, I suppose, were specifically environmental health safety, occupational health, members of our HR team, and also members of our facilities team. And again, the makeup of that may vary from company to company, or indeed based on the size of the company. But these were the key stakeholders for our own crisis team, if you like. And part of the role of that team was to develop, first of all, risk assessments and site protocols, both related to operations on the site, because that was a risk potentially that was faced on a daily basis. And secondly, for personnel who were working off-site or working remotely. And I suppose a third function of that team is really to provide immediate and strategic business decisions, because again, I suppose we were fortunate in the sense that our business was able to continue, unlike many other types of business in industry, but we were fortunate enough to be able to continue. And in order for that to happen, obviously there are immediate decisions which have to be made in order to protect the workforce and others, and then strategic business decisions for the long-term sustainability of the business as well. So I suppose most of us here hopefully are familiar with the hierarchy of risk controls, and I suppose we adapted this in some way to reflect the risk and also the different types of controls available to us on the site, and just picking out, I suppose, the top two here off the tier in terms of elimination and substitution of hazard or risk. The main focus here for us was either removing the hazard, so isolation or quarantine to avoid contact with the hazard or contact with others. We can't replace the hazard, so substituting or changing work practices. And I suppose that's for us where social distancing on site came in, but the remote working option was the one that is more appropriate, I suppose, in the circumstances for our remote off-site work team. So I think that's a useful illustration, not alone for general risk control, but I think it's very useful for addressing the different types of control mechanisms which are available during the pandemic as well. So what do we do then during the pandemic and lockdown and as things progressed? I suppose the first thing was to support employees, and again, talking about remote workers specifically. Remote workers are obviously, you know, all employees, different backgrounds, different circumstances, different needs. And so, like any other organization, we would have people who may live alone, people who are, you know, in relationships, have children, spouses. I mentioned earlier about other people in the household who may be at risk. Perhaps people with young children, and as we know, for quite a period of time, homeschooling was a recommendation coming from schools where schools had closed down, and the need to educate children. So a wide variety of needs and circumstances. So it's not like one size fits all, and what suits some people may not suit other work groups. And later on I'll talk about the pros and cons and what people liked or disliked about working from home. Another way, I suppose, in terms of supporting employees directly was through their manager and also through our occupational health service. And again, I'm cognizant of the fact that different companies may have different levels of support within their organization. And again, for us as a large, medium to large organization, I suppose we're have the advantage of having an occupational health service based on the site, and also remote support for occupational health services. So in terms of identifying vulnerable worker groups and people who were working remotely and had those different needs, we were able to call on the expertise, particularly from occupational health, to assist and support those employees. Of course, physical needs and the need to set up home office is important when people are working remotely. So we were able to put together online training for people through an online training system. Providing online training and also online risk assessment. So I think Kay may have mentioned this at the start of her presentation, in terms of identifying what was going okay for people, and then perhaps identifying some of those needs. And I go on then here to mention about hardware. So, you know, in the beginning, it was simple things like chairs, IT equipment, but there were also issues, you know, around connectivity in particular. And some people, you know, depending on where you're living, we all, I think, have experience of having good broadband or perhaps poor broadband. And I found personally that you know, meetings in the morning and online Teams meetings went very well, but when I went to the afternoon, I don't know, was it a lot more people coming online, or maybe college students getting online for seminars or classes? I certainly found that the broadband started to suffer in the afternoon. So we had all those kind of challenges from a hardware perspective. And I suppose what I haven't mentioned here is also the IT support and the ability to dial in and contact and get support from IT, from occupational health, or indeed from HR if that was needed. So as well as those physical needs, I suppose it's the soft skills or the soft needs as well, and having people available to help and support colleagues working from home. The third item or heading I have here then is around communications. And one of the things we did in Q2 was to conduct a remote worker survey. So how we did that is we gathered together a group of wider group of stakeholders, if you like, both people who were working remotely in different circumstances and people who were based on the site. And again, from that stakeholder group, occupational health and HR people, to form a survey for remote workers. and to get some feedback from them on how things were working, what worked well, what didn't work so well, what did they enjoy about working from home, and what were the main challenges they experienced. And later on, I'll present just for a few minutes on some of the feedback we got from that. I suppose the other part that's important for communications as well was protocols and site arrangements, certainly in the earlier stages. So what were the kind of routines that were necessary within teams, and also for those people who were either coming back to site or on the rotational shift-based system, what were the site arrangements? Because we were obviously changing the workplace. So things like one-way systems, staggered shifts, different starting times, what were the arrangements for entering changing rooms, for changing into uniforms, and etc. Changes around meeting rooms and how people were meeting, any PPE requirements for if there was challenges around physical distancing or social distancing. And then I suppose more recently, once the government return to work protocol was issued, how that was dealt with, and then what kind of, again, changing routines we had on the site for people returning to work. Because some of the comments we had is that, you know, the workplace I came back to was very different to the workplace I left. So getting people accustomed to that and understanding that before they actually came onto site. And then, of course, communications through the manager. I haven't included HR here as well, but obviously any changes in policies and things like that. But indeed, managers or teams having virtual coffee sessions, and I suppose a lot of teams have experience of that now. We're 6-7 months down the line, and I think that has probably become a feature of how we do business on a regular basis anyway. So what I want to present here is, if people hopefully can see the detail here on this, is just a few snippets of information that we got back from our remote worker survey. So as I mentioned, we had about 150 people working off-site in one shape or form, and we had quite a good response rate to this. We had 129 people responded to our survey out of 150. So overall, if we take the two upper groups in the satisfaction of remote work, we had about 86% satisfaction. So a number of people who are either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. So quite a high degree of satisfaction there in terms of the remote working. In terms of their optimism then, on the lower left, we had about 71% of respondents who said they were optimistic around remote work. So it's good to see a level of optimism there in terms of people's attitude and perception of remote working. I think we did this back in June sometime, so we haven't repeated the survey, I suppose, to see whether that optimism remains at the same level or whether people have declined or improved based on their personal circumstances at home. But again, quite a number of people who are optimistic about the remote working. And on the right hand side then, what we have is the challenges that people experienced based on that feedback in the survey. So two of the top items there that came up was communication, and I think within that there's obviously can be a range of responses which would range from the technical communication side and the ability to connect through internet, etc., but also the communication through remote means, if you like, whether it's Microsoft Teams or Zoom, whatever that might be. But the actual communication piece, and certainly personally something that I would feel a challenge from the role that I do in terms of being able to respond to people, you know, whether it's an issue has come up around safety or environmental, not being on the site and being able to respond, that certainly provides challenges, and trying to provide that effective response remotely can be quite challenging on occasion. And the other thing which came back to us was about social isolation. So quite a number of people there, 1/3 of respondents mentioned that social isolation was a factor for them in terms of their remote working experience. So then just to give a snapshot of what people liked in that survey. So Some of the pros, if you like, or what people gave us feedback on the things they liked was, first of all, overall flexibility. It may be worth pointing out that we did have a work from home process prior to this pandemic hitting us, I suppose. But certainly, the nature of that has changed quite significantly for us, in the sense that it would have been quite a small proportion, like perhaps a few days per month, depending on the role that people did, to you know, working from home full time. That's a significant change. But overall, the flexibility that people experienced as a result of working from home was certainly one item that we got back. Secondly, a reduction in commuting. So we would be rurally based, would have some local employees that are within 10 or 15 minutes drive, but we would have a number of employees, quite a number of employees that might have between 45 to 60 minutes commute each way. So if you're giving back people, you know, an hour and a half to 2 hours per day of their time back, it certainly affects the life balance for people. So the reduction in commuting was another positive for people. Thirdly, a lack of distractions. Now, I have an asterisk on this because really this depends on people's role and their personal circumstances. So where people were, you know, maybe with a role which was very heavily admin based, maybe compliance roles, but also people who didn't have perhaps children to homeschool and things like that, that was mentioned as a pro for them. In other words, it worked very well for them, but I do have to stress that depends on the role and personal circumstances. And lastly, flexibility for childcare. Obviously, we did have some people with young children, and particularly the home schooling was a requirement there. So that flexibility for childcare, especially during school closure, was something that people liked. And then on the opposite hand, I suppose it's like strengths and weaknesses. You know, one strength can be a weakness on another side, but social isolation was mentioned, and again, a lot depended on people's circumstances and during lockdown. So where employees perhaps lived on their own or didn't have others living within the household, certainly that was a challenge for a lot of people. The online collaboration piece was an increasing need for people. So obviously having to change from face-to-face to online communications, but then the query of the effectiveness of that, you know, how effective are our roles if we spend all of our time or quite a lot of our time online in meetings and Teams calls. And then also the juggling childcare and work commitments. So we did have comments about hitting the wall and coping with change. And then people experiencing longer days and trying to achieve that work-life balance and maybe trying to compensate. So moving on then, I suppose, to some of the current and future challenges of remote working. You know, the fulfilling of business commitments and the flexibility, the loss of resource time and efficiency, because that is a feature of it. Training and face-to-face. I think Michael mentioned about new employees earlier on and the challenges around that and how you integrate them successfully into the workplace. And then provision of appropriate home offices. You know, this is lasting longer than a few weeks or a few months. So that challenge is certainly there. And then I mentioned earlier about returning to a different workplace. The workplace that people left is not the same as when they come back. And the whole team dynamics aspect of that is a challenge as well, and that is changing. And of course, how long it's going to last, and if we have another lockdown, if we have schools closed again, and how that might affect the work-life balance in the longer term. So what can we do about that? I suppose firstly, engaging with the workforce. So we would see getting input from our employees and involving them in trials or solutions, or getting their opinion on things is important as well, even on a small scale that we pilot that. Secondly, seeking out best practice. So what are other people doing? What's the benchmarking industry? And also I mentioned there about professional guidance. So whether it's the Health and Safety Authority, our occupational health benchmarking elsewhere, I think it's important that we do that and that we learn from that as well. And lastly, communications. I think that's reinforced really through this pandemic, getting regular feedback, sharing plans at an early stage, and making sure people are aware of changes. And it, you know, sometimes it's hard to get that right. You try to communicate regularly in the way you think that are effective, and sometimes that doesn't always work. But I think they're the main things that we would look at doing. So I'm also conscious of time here, and I think Kay has to present as well. So I've kind of rushed over the last couple of slides there. Hopefully I haven't taken up too much of your time, but I'll hand over now to Brianna to move on to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Some excellent lessons and learnings from implementing what is the new norm, I suppose. So thanks very much. We do have a couple of questions which we'll take after Kay. So thank you, Kay, if you want to come back to us.
Yeah, I'm here now, and hopefully this is going to work this time. But I don't think it is. Right. I thought by going to one screen it would come up for me, but I'm afraid it's.
Do you want me to share my screen, Kay? And you
Could
just
you actually? That
yes,
would be
you
great.
just say, Brianna, please
mind?
change, and I'll do that.
Yeah. Okay. If you just go to slide 3, that would be great, Brianna.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
I certainly can. Hope everybody else can.
Okay.
Yeah, if you just move on to slide 3, that would be great. Okay, so just pick up where we left off. As I said, it's really important that employers draft up a remote working policy that very clearly sets out the employer and the employee obligations in relation to remote working. It needs to set out the criteria and the requirements for the employee working remotely, and it needs to include information on arrangements for assessing risks and the responsibility on employees to report risks and any work-related accidents. I did see a question come in there about if somebody suffers an accident in their kitchen or the bathroom during working hours, is that a reportable accident? It's not a reportable accident to the authority. What I would say is the employer needs to set down quite clearly what the requirements are as regarding reporting, and if it's during working hours, you know, there is no harm in the employee making the employer aware, but what the circumstances were, and if they were involved in an activity outside what would be required as a work activity, then it's not really applicable for work. Obviously, the policy needs to look at what equipment is needed. Are there adequate means of communication? What training is needed in relation to working remotely? And what arrangements are in place for pre-arranged contact? And that's really important, as the other two speakers have spoken about. Removing the possibility of people feeling isolated. It's really important that there's regular communication between managers and workers at home. Obviously need to make sure the workspace is suitable for work being done as far as reasonably practicable from an employer's point of view, because you're not entitled to enter the worker's home. So you can do this by asking questions. You know, does the employee have a suitable space? Is there adequate light, ventilation and heat to work comfortably? Is there enough space for the equipment? Is the floor area clear of trip hazards? All fairly basic standard stuff. And employers can ask the employees to fill out a checklist. Obviously, again, as been mentioned previously, employers do need to take cognizance of any vulnerable employees, so pregnant employees, young or mobility impaired, and they need to consider whether the suitability of the person in the context of the home working space needs to be looked at as well. Kind of the next screen, please, Brianna. So the big question in a lot of people's minds is in relation to DSE. It is not enough to have employees carry out a self-assessment on their DSE equipment. in home. However, what we are saying at the moment is a virtual DSE risk assessment can be carried out by a competent person, either by means of smartphone, tablet, whatever. And again, if the employee is reluctant to have the video on, and that is their right because it is their home and it's their home space, then they can do it verbally over the phone. But again, obviously it's not as good as a full DSE risk assessment being carried out. But again, if the employer makes sure that the equipment, monitor, mouse, keyboard, whatever it might be, is in good condition and is suitable for the work activity, then that's important. Now that can be the equipment that was brought from the workplace, or it can be if the employee has their own equipment in the house and is happy to use that and it's in good condition, that's equally acceptable. Organising the work and encouraging the workers working remotely to take regular breaks, because people can tend to work more than their rostered hours because they get stuck into something and they forget about lunch breaks or tea breaks or finishing times. And the other thing, of course, in relation to DSE is to encourage anybody working regular at a computer station, whether it's in the workplace or at home, to stand and move every 30 minutes for about a minute. Most important thing they can do for their own health and well-being. Next slide, Brianna, please. So challenges, obviously, for employers: difficulty in monitoring performance. I mean, it's not the same as having somebody in an office or a workplace environment where you're actually physically seeing them. So there has to be a level of trust there, and if the work is getting done to the required standard, that should be enough of monitoring. Providing and maintaining the equipment, obviously there has to be IT backup for any IT challenges or problems that may arise. Carrying out DSE risk assessments, adequate, we've already spoken about. Training and upskilling, again, it's harder to do when people are working from home, but I think most training providers now have risen very well to the challenge, and there's an awful lot of training courses becoming available online. So again, employers should be utilising those as much as possible. Stress and isolation, again, Brenda spoke about it there quite a bit, people saying that they did feel they become isolated. And I think we've all, those of us that have been working from home a lot, have all felt the walls closing in a bit. So it is really important that you encourage people to keep in touch with their colleagues. Virtual coffee breaks once a week even, regular contact from managers, of course, and not just by email. It's important for people to hear voices and see faces, so that's where these sort of, when they work, things like Zoom and that work very well. Again, we've spoken about sensitive risk groups, and it can be more difficult to keep people motivated. So again, that's giving people challenges and that they don't feel that they're stuck doing the same thing, giving them a variety of tasks and setting goals. All of those things can keep people motivated. Employers, keeping in touch with employees and ensuring them of support during working hours is very important. Agreeing a means of contact and keeping to that. The frequency when contact's essential, obviously, for things like ICT support for technical difficulties or for people feeling stressed. It's important that there is set means of communications, times of communications done regularly, and obviously some things arise depending on the work being done and it may have to be postponed, but at least have it in the calendars for regular updates. Emergency contact details, again, very important for people working remotely. The next slide, please, Brianna. Sorry, I know I'm racing through this, but I'm very aware of the time and there's a lot of questions there. And of course, sorry, the next slide, Brianna.
Sorry.
Thank you. The employees have their own responsibilities, as they do in the workplace. So taking reasonable care of themselves and others, cooperating with their employers. So again, it's important that employees realise that they have responsibility and that they have to ensure they have a proper workspace setup from an ergonomic point of view, that they've told their employer what they need to be able to work safely, and that they have that in place. Keeping the workplace tidy and free of trip hazards. Again, not everybody has a dedicated home office, but the employees need to be able to identify the most appropriate space in their home for working and make sure that it's got adequate light, heat and ventilation. The employer cannot do that for them. All the employer can do is ask them, have they that. Keeping it clutter-free, not overloading sockets and avoiding trailing tables. The things that we would expect in a normal workplace environment as important at home. And again, discussing any issues or concerns that they may have and keeping in regular contact. So that's it. So sorry that was so rapid, but time is of the essence, and I think we do want to get to some of the questions.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much for that, and apologies again just on the initial.
No, I think it was at my end, so no apologies needed, Brianna.
So thank you very much, Kate, and 3 excellent speakers, and I know there are quite a few questions, so I'll hand straight over to Alison, if that's okay. Alison from the committee is going to bring up a couple of the questions.
Perfect. I'll start with the first one. So it's for Michael. What is one thing do you think a line manager can do to improve the experience of a new remote starter?
That's very simple. Communicate. Talk to them. Literally, sort of, you know, as often and as informally as they can. Sort of, when starting any new venture, sort of, as a new sort of starter, sort of, you're always self-questioning yourself. Am I doing it right? You know, am I doing it well? Am I letting anybody down? And the line manager, sort of, you know, is 100% responsible for sort of, you know, making that person feel that they are doing well or they're not doing well. So the line manager's responsibility is to proactively communicate with the new starter and the wider cohort, the wider network that they would speak to sort of, you know, the other members of staff or the other sort of colleagues that are part of their induction program, and make sure that sort of, you know, that's sort of that they are as proactive and as energetic and as enthusiastic sort of about the process as they should be. It's all just about communication. All the questions, you can ask as many questions as you want, but unless there is actually sort of, you know, some sort of rapport, some sort of build-up of trust, people will tell you what they want to hear. And a new starter especially will tell their line manager exactly what they want to hear, which, as I say, sort of is the worst thing can happen, because in the background they could be stewing away and just sort of, you know, panicking. So it is about sort of, you know, a line manager developing sort of their sort of emotional intelligence skills and sort of their softer skills in terms of being able to talk to people as opposed to talk at people.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. One more for yourself there. What was or is your biggest challenge in working from home?
I'm probably lucky enough in that sort of I was working from home for some time before I joined IOSH, but it's still a challenge of it's sort of isolation. As I say, sort of, you know, most people enjoy, and again, it depends what sort of what age group you're in. Sort of, we find sort of with the younger new starts and sort of and the existing employees, they really miss the social side of being with sort of, you know, their colleagues, and because they build friendships up with them as well. And it is that sort of that isolation. Sort of working from home previously for me was fine, but I was spending maybe 2 or 3 days out with customers, with suppliers, with sort of, you know, with other people. So I did have that interaction. So it is, the challenge is really sort of, you know, staying focused on the job and staying motivated, and sort of, you know, and it's difficult to do that without sort of the camaraderie and the sort of the contacts that you get.
Perfect. Thanks a million. Brendan, if you're there, with 3 questions for yourself. And the first one, how did your company get to know who were the workers who needed to work from home?
I suppose there's 2 ways I'll answer that. First of all, it was looking at the groups who needed to work from home, or the workers who needed to, and I mentioned that vulnerable groups earlier on, and that was done primarily with occupational health and HR and the relevant manager. So those were that was the first way. And then secondly, as a management team, we would have looked at the roles that we believed were non-critical from an operational support point of view, if you like, to work on that they could work from home. So it's two things really: is who needs to work from home because of health conditions or conditions in the house, and who can work from home. In other words, that they don't need to actually spend time on the shop floor or whatever. So they were probably the two main ways.
Perfect. Thank you. The next one then is on the next two are on your pulse survey that you carried out. The first one, the pulse survey to inquire how people had adapted to the changes, seemed very proactive. Were these a once-off? Will they be repeated periodically?
We did that in June, so I would certainly think that either by the end of this year or early into next year, we would like to repeat that, because I mentioned earlier about the optimism and, the level of optimism perhaps in even changes from summer to winter season. That optimism might wane somewhat once dark evenings come in and things like that. So we would certainly look at repeating that probably towards the end of the year.
Thank you. And on the survey, how did you identify what to ask and ensure it was capturing all avenues?
What we did, is that we selected a number of remote workers, so employees that were actually working from home, and we actually got them to design the survey and the questions as a kind of a peer group with input from occupational health and HR and ourselves in EHS as well. But primarily the questions were developed by people that were actually working from home, and I think that worked quite well. And also, with different circumstances, perhaps people living alone or living in the household on their own, as well as employees who had children or other circumstances.
Perfect, thanks a million. Kay, I just have 4 questions here for yourself. The first one are the self-VDU assessments legally binding under the 2007 regulations?
No, self-VDU assessments are not acceptable in any shape or form. It has to be, VDU assessment has to be carried out by a competent person, so it has to be somebody who is competent to carry out. So unless the remote worker is a certified VDU assessor themselves.
Perfect, thank you. Do you think there will have to be a change in the legislation to take into account working from home, as everything there is at the moment is for the workplace? A checklist is one thing, but how do you monitor compliance, or how do you fulfill other duties under the 2005 Act, such as emergency drills?
Well, again, all an employer can do is do all that is reasonably practicable. You provide the employee, ask them the questions on the checklist. You can ask them to sign the checklist. Will there be a change in legislation? Possibly. I know at the moment there is public consultation ongoing in relation to remote working. And I know there is work ongoing in-house. I think my colleague Brian Malloy is still on the line. I know he's doing some of it, going on in-house, looking at producing guidance in relation to remote working at the moment. But whether that will go as far as actually changing the legislation, that's not for me to say. Might do.
Well, funny enough, our next question then is, do the HSA intend on publishing more comprehensive guidance on remote working and employers' legal responsibilities?
Yes.
Very good.
Simple answer.
Last question then, is there a conversation to be had regarding striking the balance between the employer doing what is reasonably practical and empowering employee for working safely in line with the guidance offered by employers?
I think that conversation has already started. Like I said, there's public consultation going on out there at the moment in relation to remote working. So the conversation has started, yeah.
Perfect.
I think the pandemic has accelerated it more than likely.
Brilliant. So the last 3 questions then are open to you all. So how can employers ensure their employees are safe working at home? They can't visit to see the employees to assess their conditions, and employees may not want to reveal their conditions.
No, and like I said, that's one of the things that all employees are perfectly entitled to maintain their own privacy in their own home. The employer doesn't have any right of access, either virtually or otherwise. But we would hope that, under the employee's duty to cooperate, that they would complete checklists, that they would cooperate with their employer in relation to setting up a dedicated workspace and making sure they're as safe as possible.
Perfect. So this gentleman has seen some dreadful examples of home workstations, for example, sitting cross-legged on the bed, lying on a sofa and sitting sideways. How can or should an employer monitor these working at home?
They can't really.
Brendan here, I suppose my opinion on that, and I don't know whether it's correct or not, but I think there's no single mechanism that you can guarantee that with. I think as an employer, you know, again, doing what's reasonably practicable or possible is a combination of things. It's manager checking in on them, talking to them about it. As I said, in our circumstances, we did the online training and surveys. So I think it's training, awareness, and monitoring are the three things that I would suggest.
Brilliant, thanks, Brendan. The last question, what are the employers obliged to provide if an employee requires equipment? Is it sufficient to have a procedure outlining what employers will provide?
No, if an employee requires specific equipment to carry out a task, then the employer must provide that equipment. The legislation is quite clear to that.
And the last one that's just seen has come in there now is there anything HSA can do in monitoring compliance of employers with remote working? Kind of covered it in indirectly, but.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is there anything HSA can do in monitoring compliance of employers with remote working?
Well, yes, if we were carrying out an inspection of a workplace where some workers were working remotely, we could ask to have sight of the remote working policy and what procedures they have in place and what communication procedures they have in place. That would be the extent. Again, the authority, well, the inspectors of the authority don't have the right to enter anybody's domestic dwelling without the homeowner's permission, so we couldn't go out to check unless an employee invited us into their home.
Perfect, thanks Million. That's all the questions I have here. So I'll give it back to Brianna.
Great, thank you very much, Alison, and thanks to all of our guest speakers this evening. Very informative, and again, just to thank everybody who has stayed on. I know we have run a little bit over, but really appreciate the time. I think you would have found it very interesting and hopefully very useful. So we will be, if it's okay, we will be sharing a survey of the event. It'll be emailed out tomorrow. It's a very quick survey, 5 questions. It'd be great information if you don't mind just coming back with feedback on that. And just to say on behalf of the committee, thanks very much everybody for attending, and thanks to our speakers as well. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.